the horizon, the world's visual boundary. Today, to find out what's hidden beyond, you just have to take out a map or open your GPS. But before the existence of our modern atlases and satellites, these places were shrouded in mystery. Here be dragons. Here be dragons is an expression that was found on a map dating back to the Middle Ages to designate territories beyond known areas, the terra incognita. At that time, in Europe, it was common to fill in the gaps in drawings of the world, to fill the empty spaces on maps by placing dragons, monsters, sea serpents, strange men and women, and other legendary creatures there. Beyond the horizon, what do you think is there? After this sea, there are hills as far as the eye can see, and then huge mountains. And beyond that, a distant cousin who went there told me about a river and vast stretches of land as far as the eye can see, and then a sea of clouds. Yes, but beyond that, they say there are hot deserts, then vast white and cold expanses, and I heard there's another sea. Yes, but what lies beyond that I don't know. Beyond, it's terra incognita. Only stories, often distorted from intrepid travelers, have reached us. Some say the world ends there. But to be sure, you would have to cross the borders of our known world and plunge into the lands of mystery. Today, let's go explore the areas inhabited by dragons and retrace the history of the ends of the world, gradually pushing them back and retracing the representations of the world through the history of the people who, by drawing it, tried to fill in the blank spots. Here, to begin with, is one of the oldest maps ever discovered. This one was engraved on clay about 2,600 years ago. It symbolically represents the world from the Babylonian point of view, with the city of Babylon at its center, surrounded by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Dating from about the same period, here is now a reconstruction of all the lands known according to Anaximander of Miletus. Here, it's the Greeks' turn to symbolically occupy the center of a circle a few thousand kilometers in diameter. The world is divided into three parts: Europe, Asia, and Libya, which at the time refers to Africa. Beyond that, there are mysterious regions that cause worry and inspire dreams, and to fill these voids, the Greeks imagine a world surrounded by a vast ocean. And here now is the same map, improved a century later by Hecataeus of Miletus. Mountain ranges and rivers are beginning to appear on it. 2 centuries later, Eratosthenes would in turn propose a more detailed version with the Mediterranean at its center. The Greeks had now become aware of the existence of India. And beyond the horizons, everything is still surrounded by a vast ocean. Around the year 150, Ptolemy laid the foundations of modern cartography thanks to advances made in geometry. Distances are more precise and boundaries pushed further back. For this, people still relied on the travel accounts of certain kings, scholars, conquerors, merchants, or simple adventurers who felt the call of the horizon. The Indian Ocean appears, and beyond that, it's terra incognita. But discovering doesn't mean remembering. You can bring back spices and forget the maps of the world and its territories. The Romans, who would lose much of the Greeks' cartographic knowledge, would nevertheless produce astonishing maps such as the Tabula Peutingeriana. On this set of parchments, nearly 7 meters long, 200,000 kilometers of roads are depicted, along with the locations of cities, seas, rivers, forests, and mountain ranges. On the Tabula Peutingeriana, the entirety of the world known to the Roman Empire is drawn. From the Mediterranean, through the Near East, all the way to India and the borders of China. Here, above all, the strategic roads of the empire are shown. The important points and the distances between places are not to scale, a bit like our subway maps. But when the Roman Empire collapses, ancient geographical knowledge in the West will almost disappear with it. To make way during the Middle Ages in Europe for representations of the world steeped in Christianity. Dating from 780, here is the map of the monk Beatus of Liébana. We have now gone back 1,000 years. The world is once again depicted as a disc, this time centered on Jerusalem, and still surrounded by oceans with the famous division into 3 continents. Although lost in Europe, the works of the Greeks are preserved in the Muslim world. The geographer and scholar Al-Idrisi, building on the works of Ptolemy, created a new map of the known world in 1154 for the king of Sicily. 150 years later, at the end of the 13th century, Portolan charts appeared. These were maps created using surveys carried out by sailors. On these ancestors of nautical charts, you can find representations of trading ports, islands, and anchorages. But details of the inland areas are missing. Then comes the Renaissance. A renewed curiosity about the rest of the world re-emerges in Europe. And more than 1,000 years after its first edition, Europeans rediscover Ptolemy's geography, which they still use as inspiration to represent the world. Unknown lands are still heavily influenced by beliefs and superstitions. Dragons are still very much present. Early travelers often filled their accounts with myths and legends, sometimes describing places they never visited. By drawing inspiration from their stories, we imagine fantastic lands with mysterious peoples. Like the Blemmies, headless creatures with eyes and a mouth on their stomach, who were imagined to live somewhere in Ethiopia or perhaps in India. That's also where the Cyapods are supposed to be found. Beings with a single leg ending in a gigantic foot, allowing them to run very fast, and which they can use as parasols. On the maps of that time, still shrouded in superstition, Africa is usually cut off at Cape Bojador. This point, located in Western Sahara, was long considered by Europeans to be the southern limit of the world. Beyond that, more than the unknown, it is fear that prevails. If sailors long refused to venture into these lands, it is both because this area is filled with sharp-edged reefs, treacherous shallows, and a thick fog that can envelop you without warning. But also, and above all, because the most difficult obstacle to overcome, more than the terrain or even armies, may be that of legends. Because Cape Bojador is a psychological and symbolic obstacle. Over time, the many disappearances of boats that tried to get around it gave rise to the myth of an impassable limit. Going there meant entering the dragon's territory. The legends that circulated said that beyond lay a sea of darkness, a place of death without burial, where ships were swallowed up. The Portuguese believed that at the equator, water would boil and your skin would turn black. And to keep drawing the contours of the world, they would need to find sailors who were brave enough, reckless enough, or greedy enough to embark on such an adventure. In 1434, the symbolic barrier finally fell, thus opening the way for Portuguese explorations along the coasts of Africa. 63 years later, by gradually rounding and discovering the shores of this continent, Vasco da Gama reached the Indies. Elsewhere, shortly before the Europeans crossed Cape Bojador, the fleet of the Chinese Admiral Zhang He had undertaken, from 1405 to 1433, great reconnaissance expeditions. These expeditions would take them from the China Sea to the coasts of Southeast Asia, passing through India, eventually sailing up the Red Sea to Egypt and down the African coast as far as Mozambique. During one voyage, Zhang He brought back a giraffe from what is now Kenya. Unfortunately, no maps from these expeditions have survived. Surprisingly, the Middle Kingdom would then lose interest in exploration. Then, in the second half of the 15th century, navigation on the high seas became easier thanks to improvements in astronomical navigation tools, which made it possible to calculate the position of ships by observing the stars. This is the beginning of the Age of Discovery. The outlines of the Americas become clearer, and dragons become fewer and fewer, and smaller and smaller. And as explorations continue, the empty spaces are filled in. On the maps of the time, blank areas are often left, knowing that today's terra incognita will be tomorrow's discoveries. And it's amusing to think that Christopher Columbus, to plan his route to Japan and then to the Indies by heading west, relied on a map, Martellus's map, which underestimated the circumference of our planet and overestimated the size of the Asian lands. So he organized his expedition based on the idea that between Japan and Portugal, there was only a small ocean. The scholars who realized these calculation errors, and the princes who examined and rejected his project on the grounds that Japan was unreachable from the west, were therefore right, at least on paper. And if the American continent hadn't existed, Columbus might have gotten lost in a vast ocean. In the following decades, ships continued to sail across the globe. In 1571, on Abraham Ortelius's World Atlas, the northern outlines of Australia appeared for the first time on a map, under the name Terra Australis. The vast white area at the South Pole is not Antarctica here, but the gigantic and hypothetical southern continent. No one has yet sailed its seas. But at that time, many people believed that there had to be a continent at the far south to balance those in the northern hemisphere. The theory turned out to be wrong, but there is indeed a continent there. It would take another 250 years to see it. The explorers then ventured into the Pacific. The boundaries of unknown lands kept being pushed back. The world was gradually being mapped. The details of these outlines depend greatly on the knowledge of the countries drawing them. In the 17th and 18th centuries on some maps, Australia is conspicuously absent. On others, it appears partially, with more or less detail. Each state jealously guards its discoveries. The surveys brought back by navigators become state secrets. Knowing what lies in the uncharted lands is a bit like having a dragon. To possess great powers. In fact, at that time in Portugal, anyone who transferred maps to a foreigner was liable to the death penalty. And here is the whole world known by the French Navy in 1755. You can see that part of Australia is still missing. Along the east coast it says, we have no knowledge of this part. New Zealand is barely drawn. And Antarctica is still missing. The northwestern territories of the Americas are the last refuge of the remaining uncharted lands. All of this is unknown. What is called the Western Sea could be placed in this area. We don't know if there are lands or seas in this part. So many territories still unknown to the world, except to their inhabitants. Nearly 80 years later, in 1830, Edward Quinn created 21 fog of war maps to show the evolution of geographical knowledge from a Western perspective. Only the Northwest Passage and Antarctica remain unexplored. The shadowy areas have melted away like snow in the sun. The last dragons are now covered in ice and relegated to the polar regions or a few dense forests. Because even though man has traveled around the world, even though most of the coastlines are precisely known, the interior lands at the heart of Africa or Papua still remain a great mystery for Europeans. A terra incognita as far as maps were concerned. Just like Antarctica, which, although it was first seen in 1820, would still have to wait a few more decades before appearing in detail on atlases. The few little dragons that still resist then look like famished lizards, curled up in a few remote and hard-to-reach corners. There is almost nothing left to map. But have these unknown lands really disappeared today? If you look more closely, the dragons might still be there. Driven from the land, they have simply taken to the heights or are hiding in the depths. Today, it is estimated that 95% of the abyss remains unexplored. More people have gone into space than to the deepest parts of the oceans, and our bathymetric maps, which show the contours of the ocean floor, are often less precise than those of the surface of the moon. The horizon line that hides unknown territories may have actually expanded, literally moved farther away. At the beginning of the last century, we knew of only one galaxy, our own. Today, we count about 100 billion of them. In fact, unexplored areas are more numerous than ever, because the largest map we know is now that of our observable universe. A sphere centered on Earth, 880,000 billion kilometers in diameter, containing all the objects whose light has had time to reach us since the birth of the universe. And beyond this limit, called the cosmological horizon, it's terra incognita.